Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. Thanks for joining me here on the program, and we are talking about trade and China. I had a coworker walk into my office and go, "Did you realize they have like a 250% tariff?" I was like, "Yeah, no, it's pretty crazy." And then, I don't know, man. I don't know what we're doing. I get that China, we need to be skeptical of China. I did a podcast on the Pat Down, and basically, I'm of two minds, right? Some days I'm like, China's going to dominate us. We're screwed. They have the upper hand. And then other days I'm like, they're going to collapse. They're old. Their economy isn't growing. People are fleeing their manufacturing there. I don't know. So I need a calm voice. And Alex Rosado is joining me. So Alex is a professional programs assistant at the Alexander Hamilton Society. We won't hold that against him being John Adams and Thomas Jefferson fans here, but he's a managing foreign policy event programming in their alumni network. And he's also a research fellow for the Horizon Info Consult and External Relations Internet Ballotpedia. So, he has studied foreign trade and immigration and all kinds of different issues specifically surrounding China. And he and I talk about, the future of trade. First, how have they been bad actors? Second, what's going on in the trade war? And third, where should we think about trade with China, right? I think it is obvious that since the pandemic, a lot of manufacturing is thinking, okay, let's come back to the United States, because here's the reality, right? So much of our trade policy right now, we're fighting to protect jobs that were lost in 1976. Like, I'm sorry, a lot of steel mills and mining, those are great jobs for the people that do them. We're probably not going to have a raw materials industry because people don't like their rivers being lit on fire. And we implemented a lot of economic or environmental standards here in the United States that cleaned up a lot of our streams and our groundwater. And that is a big reason why people went overseas. And then, what's awesome? In that 50 years, in that shift, we've raised the standards in those other places too. And taken people from three-walled huts to a thriving economy. And free trade rises all boats. It's good for people around the world. And in the future of AI, though, I think a lot of these companies are thinking about, all right, where should we manufacture? If most manufacturing is going to be robotic in the next few decades, why not bring those plants home and build in American communities? I mentioned Lilly. They're one example of a company that is building heavily here in Indiana, where they're based. And it exports more manufactured life sciences like products than any other state. Pacemaker, a heart catheter, probably came from Indiana, right? And that is only growing in terms of share as people kind of look and go, I don't want the political instability of China and the IP theft of China. I'm going to stay here in America, which is why it's important for us to maintain political stability, economic predictability, and good tax rates, and protecting people's IP with a strong security network. So we've had our quibbles with the NSA, but there are things like protecting American companies that they do right. So it's important for some of these structures in the United States to make sure that we are protecting American manufacturing by not being crazy. We'll see what we can do, right? It's going to be a long... Well, I've got 40 years left, and I think it's going to be crazy. So we'll see. But that's why we have this show. That's why we love talking with you. That's why we love talking to people like Alex Rosado. So let's do that. Let's get on with the conversation about trade in China with Alex Rosado. Alex, thanks so much for joining me here on the program today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your article caught my eye. It's called Returning to Phase One is a Step Backwards. And I'm not going to lie. I'm just your typical average American who doesn't know much about the world. Maybe a little more than most people, but I'd never heard of Phase One in terms of trade between China and America. And I wanted to talk to you because you really kind of went into detail into what bad trading partners China is often. And this is not a justification show for tariffs. I'm not for tariffs. I don't know about you. Alex seems smart, so he's probably not either. but we we're going to get into that today. So let's just start with phase one. So this phase one agreement with China between us and China and the United States, what is that?
Sure. So phase one goes all the way back to about 2016 when Donald Trump, who was still a Republican presidential candidate at the time, said that China was engaging in job theft. And if he was elected president, he would go and enact sections 201 and 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 to try and put an end to that. So he did exactly that when he got into office in 2017. He initially posed broadband tariffs on steel-centric goods such as solar panels and washing machines for a lot of different countries. But then in July of 2017, you saw him really narrow the focus to China and slapping reciprocal tariffs against the country, to which China didn't take lightly to that, and they ended up getting into that first trade war and kerfuffle that some may say that happened a lot in 2018 and 2019. And the tariffs at that time were at a high of about 21.1% on the Chinese end and 21% on the American end. So what they ended up deciding to do is let's take a step back from the tariffs, let's get to the negotiating table, and let's work out a deal. So that's how phase one came about in January of 2020 and accomplished a lot of different feats, some of which materialized, some of them didn't.
Okay, so you go into essentially like this phase one deal was touted as a win, but China only fulfilled 57% of its commitments. So why did it fail in your view? And was it realistic to begin with? Or are they just in the habit of signing these agreements and then going, yeah, we promise to follow up?
Well, a trade deal in any negotiation in that matter is as good as the partners that are engaged with it. And especially for China, they have a history of not only not abiding by these trade deals, but also fleecing the current market conditions for them to gain optimal outcomes with it. But specifically with phase one, you saw that a study conducted by the Peterson Institute of Economics said that China only reached 57% of their purchase commitment, as you said, but the agricultural sector and their commitments were about 83% complete. And while some may say that's an achievement and success, unfortunately, it can't be contributed all to that phase one agreement. China had increased its pork imports originally due to a swine fever outbreak within Africa. And they also raised their corn and wheat imports specifically because of a World Trade Organization ruling back in 2019 that forced their hand to do so. So there's a lot of confounding economic factors when you look at it. And especially with what China did with some of the phase one materials and outlines, they didn't abide by it, specifically with transshipment. They said, let's go to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos to try and bypass some of these certain trade barriers that the U.S. put up. So that way we can save some of our money and the U.S. can lose revenue, specifically on some imports. So there's a lot of different techniques that China did in trying to navigate this. And overall, phase one wasn't as effective as it could have been because China didn't adhere to the spirit of the deal.
Okay, so what are some other things that they did? Some of the tactics you mentioned: transshipment, invoice manipulation, product reclassification. Like, go down the list of the things that China does to circumnavigate around these different agreements.
Sure. So the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer at the time, back in 2017, said that China was negotiating and partaking actively within manipulating their own currency, the yuan. And that way they did it so that way it was undervalued. It made their exports cheaper and it made the U.S. increase their trade deficit. So that way China gets to abide by at least the good terms of the deal by also saving some of it up for their economy because the Chinese economy isn't doing super well. You saw that in recent years, their GDP growth has been down the tubes. Basically, with their autocracy that they have, especially with Xi Jinping and his love for state-run enterprises, you're seeing too that those are getting a lot more share within the public and private sectors, as opposed to entrepreneurialism and some of those other market conditions that would restore more of those laissez-faire principles that we like instead of protectionism. But in terms of the falsification of invoices, that's a way for them to smuggle products, specifically semiconductors, at a lower rate. And unfortunately for U.S. consumers and product producers, manufacturers, if they sign false invoices that don't have realizable serial numbers, fake email addresses, or whatever is on that sheet, they might be at a risk too, not only of losing money, but also of tax evasion charges. So truly, this is China's way of exploiting some of these systems to try and benefit themselves, not only in the short term to correct their economic shortcomings, but in the long term to have more of an environment that's favorable to them.
So you mentioned earlier the moving to other countries, right? So when I saw Cambodia was one of the first countries to come and talk with Trump about getting a new trade deal, I went, oh, I know what that's about. What is it about? What is this loophole that they've found, and how do we fix that in future deals?
So it's basically them having some more alternative trade routes as opposed to going directly to the United States. They figure that if they add some middlemen into the equation, then that way they could reduce some of their rates on their end and not have to adhere to some of the tariffs. Because the tariffs imposed by the United States, especially with the recent Liberation Day speech that President Trump gave back earlier in April, now the rates as of today are about 145% on China. China, conversely, has rates of about 125% to America. So these are way past what we've been dealing with phase one back in 2020. This is about 6 times as much. So what you're seeing with some of these other countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, they have that flat kind of blanket tariff fee that is about 10%, maybe a little bit more. So China's saying, let's go to these countries that aren't being taxed as much, that don't have as much regulatory barriers. Let's use them as a base as opposed to bearing some of the costs up front. That is going to be detrimental to their economy. So it's more so of them looking for alternative options for their own benefit as opposed to still abiding by and confronting the U.S. directly.
Yeah, so I was arguing with my friend John today. John is a little more right wing and he's libertarian. He didn't vote for Trump, but he's on board. He teaches manufacturing, so he talks rightly about the hollowing out of a lot of American manufacturing at certain points and how China's a bad partner in all of this. And I reminded him I can literally shoot a BB gun at the headquarters of Eli Lilly right now, which just introduced several $billion initiative to build 4 new factories, including a medicine plant here in Indiana. A lot of Trump folks will say, well, that's, Lilly in February had this giant American flag behind them, and I think they're trying to take some of the optics and get some promotion out of their deal. And Trump took credit for that. My gut says, first, that takes years for an Eli Lilly to plan for multi-billion-dollar plants to build medicine in the United States as opposed to China. But I would think that the way that China acted after the pandemic, first, causing the pandemic, secondly, not sharing data about the pandemic, threatening to withhold respirators and medicine, scared a lot of manufacturers and major companies that are in essential services like manufacturing medicine to start thinking about reshoring a lot of these jobs. Is my gut right? And how much of what you're talking about in this article informs this shift back to America and taking things away from China and decreasing investment in China?
Sure. So I think a fantastic example to bring up was actually yesterday on April 15th, when the U.S. issued export licensing requirements for NVIDIA and AMD chips to China. And they also announced this week, NVIDIA, that they're going to begin producing chips in factories in Arizona and will build supercomputers in Texas, which is fantastic for American manufacturing. It's going to produce a lot of new jobs, especially within those areas. But you also have to realize that that decision wasn't made because of the recent tariff cycle. These, of course, developments, especially within the business world, takes years to materialize. Most of them never get out of the concept phase. But especially when it comes to the reshoring of American manufacturing jobs, you saw that in February, it was the highest rate of growth for internal manufacturing jobs in 15 months. And that was due to some domestic policies, not much because of the tariffs, but also because of the free market solutions that came from a lot of these economic toolkits that you're seeing. And I think that's one that is going to completely shift and change the game of how the United States approaches China, because in some ways, China, or at least the United States, isn't doing super well competitively in terms of shipbuilding. You see that with commercial shipbuilding, China now has more than half of the world's commercial ships. The U.S. produced 5 last year. In terms of their global commercial shipment marketing share, China has 50%. The U.S. has just fallen to less than 0.1%. And I mean, according to Newsweek, China now has the largest naval fleet as well, which they can use to co-opt certain countries to certain economic policies. This is exactly what you're seeing, what they're doing with Taiwan as well, with those military encirclements of the island. So you really have to invest in America, not only in just in manufacturing, but in shipbuilding as well. Trump understands that. He implemented a brand new Office of Shipbuilding, which is going to have more of these ports within the southern states that used to be strongholds for it. They just utterly collapsed in the last couple of years. But it's the way of having American manufacturing coming back by investing in it, and the effects are going to proliferate outwards.
Yeah, and we've done episodes on the Jones Act, which would be a huge step in the right direction if he killed the Jones Act. I don't think a lot of people understand or realize, and this is what the Panama Canal thing is about, what Greenland is about. When you control shipping lanes, especially on the seas, you have more global security, you have more trade, you have more peace, where when free trade flows, bullets don't fly often. And so it's actually very important that America returns to shipbuilding and shipping, and for sure. I'm of two minds of China, right? Partially, I hear stats like that and it scares the crap out of me. Man, we're losing. My wife taught Chinese kids English overnight on something called VIP Kid before China shut it down to make sure that their kids didn't have contact with Westerners. But she was teaching kids, and basically what was happening is these kids were describing their life. They're going to school from like 5 or 6 a.m. to 5 or 6 p.m. And then on the weekends, they're either doing a STEM project or they're a military camp. Their education is incredibly rigorous, right? They seem to have a lot together. But then I also kind of read your article and they're falling apart, right? John said today, we have the upper hand in this trade war because China's just ready to collapse because their economy's bad. I'm sure the truth is not black or white, but kind of help me suss out, as I think the American government starts to beat the war drums. China is obviously a foe. Is it an enemy? Is it weak? Is it strong? What's your view on it?
Sure. So I think a lot of it comes down to power projection. And it's the image that China is capable of having sort of a global hegemony, or at least the attempts to try and have one when it comes to economics and even going back to their naval fleets, trying to have sort of this hemisphere that they want to control under their influence. But when you take a look at internal Chinese policies and developments, it tells a very vastly different tale. In terms of population decline, according to NPR, you see that China's population fell for the third consecutive year last year, and it dropped by about 1.4 million people. Still, their population is 1.4 billion people, but the population is so upside down that there's a large elderly population now, and they're not gaining enough ground in terms of rebirths to offset that. And a lot of that has to do with the one-child policy that was enacted. And especially with the elderly population, it's going to co-opt the government to provide more for Social Security and healthcare funding, which is going to divest from other critical areas and weaken China's ability to compete abroad. You're also seeing some key economic factors like their GDP growth slowing down to about 4.75%, which is a sharp contrast from what they were projecting back in the 2010s when they were annually hitting about 7 to 8%. You also see that China's household savings are surging because there's low consumer confidence. People don't want to engage with state-run enterprises. They don't trust them. They see that they don't provide quality services and products. So they figure, let's keep the money under the mattress where we know where it is. You're also seeing, too, with the housing markets, they invested so much in housing. There's 65 million unattended and unoccupied properties right now in China, and many large developers, including Evergrande, have filed for bankruptcy or defaulted on their loans. And you're seeing that half of China's population living in rural areas have low per capita income. So there's a lot of different areas at play, and it's making sure that China's international presence greatly outweighs a lot of the domestic problems that they're having. And it's one that is making them very unstable and one that is going to set them on a collision course truly with time.
What do you think that, how does that impact strategy right now in the current trade war with China?
Well, there's certainly a lot of internal economic turmoil that has to be at first addressed. And China's way of kind of shoving that to the side is saying, well, we're going to do shipping. We're going to invest in our military very heavily. You're seeing that even with their workers right now, according to the China briefing, back in 2023, they said that they faced a shortage of highly skilled workers, particularly in the technology, healthcare, and engineering sectors, where you're going to need that for international competitiveness. And this is due to a lot of younger Chinese folk preferring non-manufacturing jobs. So China isn't doing a fantastic job of incentivizing their youth to get into these industries that is going to be vital for their nation's survival. And it actually, in that part, you're seeing that a lot of Chinese folks are rebelling against the system, but it's more so silently because they can't do so out loud. And especially when it comes to the United States, this is where they could potentially shine. There's a lot of research and development going on within the United States, and actually they're the leading developer of a lot of research that is being used by a lot of international actors, including China as well. So you're seeing that happen in droves. You're also seeing that, especially with clean energy technologies, the US is trying to get back on track with China because China is still the largest producer of solar panels, about 90% of the global output, and especially with batteries too, about 70%. So the US is trying to close the gap, especially with China's mistakes that they've made internally. It's going to make for a very interesting dynamic going forth, irrespective of all the tariffs. There's so many different things in sectors that you have to keep your eye on.
Yeah, artificial intelligence is one of those places where it's like, man, the Ezra Klein podcast with the former Biden AI chief was nerve-wracking because if they get AGI before an American company gets AGI, I don't want them to be I don't want them to have a leg up on us in anything, considering what they did to the Uyghurs. But Tyler Cowen just wrote an article this week in the Free Press about don't panic because America has won a massive soft power victory in that the AGI models that the world is working on are all based in American thought inputs, right? Like, so China's DeepSeek, while it may be more powerful than something that OpenAI is building, is it is as Western as anything else. I mean, when it comes to AI and that race, how does that factor into trade? I mean, do you have any insight into AI and China's race there? And I know this is not necessarily on the phase one article we're talking about, but I'd love to hear any thoughts you have.
Sure. Well, the U.S. is set up to compete within its services sector as well, not just within AI, but just in general. The Commerce Department recently put out a report saying that the United States is now boasting a surplus of about $295 billion from 2024, which is a 5% increase from 2023 and a 25% rise from 2022. So the U.S. is consistently exporting a lot more services, whether it be finance, technology, film, and tourism. Although China did say recently that they might stop importing U.S. films just as a way of getting back at a cultural soft power standpoint. And the U.S. consistently exports more than China and the rest of the world. So the U.S. has leverage on that regard. And even factoring in AI, you're seeing a lot of more companies like OpenAI, models such as Perplexity, Claude, even ChatGPT. They're all housed within America. And especially with China with DeepSeek, there was a report that came out today, actually. It said that China, or at least the U.S., is considering banning U.S. clients from using DeepSeek as sort of now kind of a cold war between the AI, as opposed to which services you can and can't use. That should be up to the consumers, and the consumers should know which risks come with which platforms, especially those that are harbored in foreign countries that may harvest your data. But when it comes to AI, America is leading the way, and that can be ascribed to other components and acts such as the CHIPS Act that was passed last year, and then some other manufacturing trends that you're seeing and the reshoring of companies, private and public, back to the United States.
Yeah, so let's talk about IP. This is one ding against China is that they steal our IP. Give us more context to that.
Sure. So with the IP, China didn't really have a lot of safeguards when it came to copyright. There was a lot of different infringements with properties, not only just cultural in the sense of movies and other technologies, but also more business. They had no trade secrets that were labeled. So with the phase one agreement that came about in 2020, U.S. representatives, not only just in trade, but also within commerce and sometimes within their cultural sectors as well, they said, China, you need to step up your game with this. and China abided by it. They implemented damages for something called willful infringement, which means that your property is your property. They altered burden proof, which means that if you were the ones that got copyrighted, you suffer less of a default from it. So it protects the consumers and protects the victims of these crimes. And they also finally phrased confidential business dealings as trade secrets, as any liberal democracy should have, although China is not liberal by any means. And all of these were within the affiliated U.S. legal constructs. So China was adopting Western standards, implementing it within their society. And it was a way for them to promote accountability, widen the scope of misappropriation. And you see that, especially with IP protections, trade dominant cities like Beijing, Shanghai, could finally have some financial markets with a little bit of freedom. And consumers can engage in it according to what they see fit. There was more of an entrepreneurial spirit with that as well. And it just made a lot of goods and services accelerate through these markets and exchanges by having the market be in control rather than the state-run government and some of these other enterprises that you're seeing that are mainly funded by Chinese autocrats.
So essentially, were they hacking into American companies and stealing it, or were they, a Tesla builds factories there and then they have all kinds of spies like working in to send over to their electrical vehicle makers? I mean, I get like bootlegging movies. That one seems, we've mastered that one. But and then they just said that they're not enforcing the laws that you're talking about, or what did Z just say about IP law in the trade war, that they're just not going to enforce any of the stuff that you just mentioned?
So beforehand, it was China signing on saying we will do a lot of these things, but China's more so not for the adopting, but of the coercive measures. And you saw that with technology transfer. They forced a lot of non-Chinese companies to surrender some of their trade secrets just because of threat of bankruptcy.
I remember. So wasn't this like Facebook? They wanted Facebook's code basically to allow them into the country. I remember that now.
That's right. It's more so the infiltration into these already existing systems as opposed to developing alternatives. I mean, especially with DeepSeek, it was built off of source code that came from other AI materials. It wasn't one that was built from scratch by Chinese engineers and software developers. A lot of what they have is foundation built on Western ideas, but they're spinning it in their own context. So I think especially when it comes to forced technology transfer, there are ways of stopping them. It's supporting independent market research so that way you can have transparency initiatives. And if there is anything that needs to be brought to light, expose the distortions so that way you can inform global investors and consumers of these market trends and the predatory practices that China is engaging with. You also saw that the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States now has a subpoena power, which its lawyers can use to compel disclosure from companies and make it harder for firms to withhold information if there are some fishy things that go behind the scenes. So really a lot of these recommendations that can be built off of phase one have to do with transparency, has to do with free market, and it has to do with gauging economic liberty, not just for the citizens of the United States, but to better off China and make it more liberal as a result.
Orrin Cass would disagree with you, but I do. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think, this idea that we're being ripped off by China and that we're using slave labor there, it's, well, no, we've improved the standards and lifted them out of slavery. I mean, I think free trade is ultimately a positive, and that's why I don't quite understand the Trump administration's, I'm not going to assign like a strategy here, right? It's central planning without the planning, it seems like. He keeps putting the tariffs on, taking the tariffs off. How do I put it? If we were to assign a strategy, is this like an end to free trade with China and reversing Nixon and Clinton and the investment in China, and we're retreating from them and we're trying to block off them stealing our IP? Excuse me, because we recognize there's no playing nice. The best way to handle it is that we have to put up barriers, wall them off, which is why it's crazy we canceled TPP, because it was meant to use free trade to wall China off. Or is this just sort of like Trump just what's your sense of what the strategy is here with the current administration's policies as of today?
Well, it's a lot of people would say, and especially within the media, that it's protectionist, and it certainly may be prescribed as so. And especially when you're competing in a global economy, you're going to need global actors that will support you. And even though the United States has the largest economy within the world, truly it needs allies to counter China because the China threat is growing. Their power projection is strengthening, even though their internal economy, as we discussed before, is on the collapse and seems to be in shambles. But I think there are other opportunities that the United States can use that can dissuade from tariffs and also just promote the well-being of the rules-based international order. And one of them is the World Trade Organization. Donald Trump isn't the biggest fan of the World Trade Organization, but it is decently effective. And the United States has a track record of not only bringing complaints and filing disputes within the World Trade Organization's parameters, but they also have won the most out of all of the countries that have filed within the World Trade Organization. Actually, in fact, from 2006 to 2017, you saw that the US brought 20 formal WTO disputes against the Chinese government. But in that same period, they only filed 12 against all other countries. Most of the time, they ruled within the United States' favor and tried to level the playing field within China. So it condemned China's treatment of, as we discussed before, movies, books, TV, music, and just their alleged failure to enforce intellectual property. So those are mechanisms that are in place. There are also international trade courts that you could appeal to have some punitive rulings. And if China doesn't obey, they get fined, they get sanctioned, and just abiding by some of these rules. And even the Cato Institute would say that the WTO is member driven. They announced this in a 2023 report looking at some of these mechanisms. And they said it can be biased against the United States because of its winning record, and also because it is one body that is composed of members with one another. There isn't an overarching institution. So it's one where it's a level playing field and people can just sort it out there, as opposed to isolating themselves and trying to figure it out all by themselves.
Do they abide by WTO rulings?
Does China abide by them?
Yeah, right.
Most of the time, yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, because I mean, we're seeing now with our own Supreme Court, if you don't want to listen to them, then I guess you just don't have to. And that's usually the problem with like an autocratic way of thinking. So, all right, where would you like to see us go? So final question, where would you like to see us go in terms of trade with China? How would you structure things? Kind of send us off with your vision of the future with China.
Sure. So how do we win the trade war? And not only is it leveraging those international institutions like the World Trade Organization, it's also calling upon our allies, because you can't stand alone in today's globalized economy. I would say Japan is one of our most strong allies, and they were ones that didn't reciprocate with tariffs once the blanket tariffs on Liberation Day were originally announced. Actually, Japan started restructuring their trade team and negotiations to try and satisfy U.S. demands. And Trump recognized this. He said that countries that don't respond with reciprocal tariffs will be awarded. Now you're seeing that with Japan's actions, you're having a whole slew of countries, about 70 as of today, trying to negotiate free market tactics with the United States, not because tariffs aren't super effective, but because free market solutions are better. And it's more of a diverse economic toolkit that countries can use, countries can experiment with. There's a lot of creativity with it, and also doesn't hold them to a certain account because it gauges the good faith with each country, and specifically with the EU as well. A lot of those countries aren't the most favorable towards China. China doesn't really like them either. So that you might see the EU try and enact some free market policies in the future. You're also seeing with intellectual property, as we discussed here, making sure that those Western values proliferate across the globe, making sure that China adopts them, and also just monitoring their expansion with clean energy, making sure that they aren't gaining a monopoly through forced technology transfer, and just making sure that we're first and foremost investing within America. Having those shipbuilding ports that are being invested in within the South, especially states like Louisiana, Georgia, making sure that you have some port fees too, up to $1.5 million, specifically on Chinese-made ships. Make it be based on vessel capacity, not just a one satisfy all rule. Definitely have some mandates for U.S. flag shipping as well, so that way China is deterred from doing transshipment, and also freeing Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia from Chinese influence. It's making sure that China stays in its place, making sure China learns its lessons, making sure that tariffs aren't the primary source of economic intervention. It should be more free market principles, and I hope that both countries learn that when engaging with trade policies in the future.
Well, I'm going to send this to Xi and Trump. I'll cut that out and clip it and send it right to them. And I think they'll agree, hopefully. It was a great case, and I appreciate your time, Alex. Where can people follow your work?
You can follow me on Twitter/X at Alex P. Rosado.
All right. Thanks so much for your time. We really do appreciate it. And thank you for listening. We really do appreciate your time. And the best way to help this podcast grow is to share it with your friends. We'll see you again next week here on The Chris Spangle Show.